Today we're talking about the menstrual cycle. And when we were growing up, the menstrual cycle was something that you wanted to avoid and that you didn't want to talk about.
Nobody talked about it.
Nobody talked about it. And that you endured it. And we would like you to stop enduring your cycle and to embrace it and to learn how to work with it for your best benefit.
I see a lot of women who struggle with irregular cycles or symptomatic premenstrual syndrome, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PCOS, endometriosis, infertility. I mean, there are just so many things that can go wrong. I just think it's a miracle when it does go right.
So let's talk about what it would look like if it went right.
If it's going right, you start your period, that's called menarche, and that's typically between ages 10 and 14. And, there can be precocious puberty where it's more like 9, 8 and 9 that some young women will start. And then other young women don't start till they're 17 or 18. So within that realm, that can be somewhat normal. But you start your periods and it's normal for them to be irregular or troublesome at the beginning. And then as you get a few years into that things normalize, or you decide they're not going to normalize. So the menstrual cycle has 4 phases within it. The first phase is really just the menstrual phase. You're having your period and your energy's pretty low. You can be somewhat irritable. You just don't necessarily want to be around people. And it's probably a good time to do a little introspection and not be really active. Maybe your exercise then is more about the yoga or Pilates and not quite as active as it can be some other points of the menstrual cycle. But going through your period, that's usually the most symptomatic for women. And so that's like the day 1 to day 5. Day 1 to day 7, somewhere in there, it would be considered a normal period. And then after that, you go into the follicular phase. And here in the follicular phase, your estrogen is climbing and you're really trying to mature the follicles that are in the ovary and get them ready for ovulation. And as that estrogen rises, you get more energy, you feel happier. It's actually a very good time to do maybe a heavier or harder exercise program. And it's still important to get really good sleep, but it's a good time to start projects and to be a little more active as you're prepping for ovulation. And that can run, day 5 to 14 or 7. I mean, some women will ovulate early around day 10. So it is nice to keep track of symptoms of this next phase, which is the ovulation phase. And that's, typically we talk about that being days 14 through 16. But like I said, it can differ. And that ovulatory phase, some women will feel a little twinge where their ovary is in kind of that lower pelvic area, and that's called Mittelschmerz. But not every woman feels that. You can have a little more, we call it in medicine, it's leukorrhea, but a little more drainage, thicker vaginal drainage, and that can be a sign of it. You can take your body temperature. And now they have the great, Oura rings and all those fancy gadgets that will actually track ovulation. And ovulation, you get your peak in estrogen, and it's the highest it will be through the whole cycle is at ovulation. And you get a little peak in testosterone. Women, our testosterone doesn't go up and down like it does in men, but it will peak around ovulation, which makes sense. Then you're a little friskier, So the body loves these. I mean, it's basically really the life cycle, really of how we cycle these hormones and and prep to have a baby. That's the whole gist of it. So ovulation, some women will be somewhat symptomatic through that. And then after that, you go into the luteal phase. So at ovulation, the egg leaves the ovary and it leaves a little cluster of cells called the corpus luteum. And that's just a progesterone making factory. You want it to be. You want it to make a lot of progesterone because then that progesterone builds a thick uterine lining in thinking about fertilization of the egg and implanting the egg into that lining of the uterus. And then from there, you make a placenta and you can grow a baby. If that doesn't happen, then, and you're looking at days 17 through about 28 of that monthly cycle. If fertilization doesn't happen, then you slough off that thickened lining that you were trying to make and you have a period. So, and then at the end of that, your hormones just drop. So the lowest your hormones ever are is in the menstrual phase, the highest ovulation, and the others are somewhat in between. But if things work well, then you have a period every month. You don't have really bad cramping. Younger women, it's very, very common to have them feel more cramping than after you've done a few years of that. But, women with PMDD can get a very, very severe mood disorder. And PMS, you can have symptoms of anywhere in the luteal phase to the menstrual phase. You can have breast tenderness, irritability, and almost all of those mean that you're estrogen dominant, which is pretty much the case in our world. We have so many, I'm going to talk about chemicals again, those hormone disrupting chemicals, the things in plastics, the phthalates, the BPAs, in fragrances and lots of petroleum products that sometimes we'll put on our skin and things like that. They disrupt our ability to make progesterone. They're somewhat estrogenic in nature, and so we just feel like we have a lot of estrogen, and then you're irritable. Really irritable.
Because they say estrogen is like fire to progesterone is like the ice that cools it off. And that's why it's so important for us to have such good balance and why our cycle functions the way it functions. Mm-hmm. When I grew up, and probably when you grew up, we did track our cycles so that we would know when we were going to bleed. Mm-hmm. But that's the only thing that we really paid attention to or noticed. And so I've got some notes here because I don't want to miss any of these, but I want women to really take note of why it's important to know where you are at every stage of your cycle, not just your bleed cycle, which might be the inconvenient part of your cycle. Mm-hmm. So, that menstrual cycle, that bleed phase is really the time to rest.
Yes.
And we've talked a lot about in our episodes about the importance of getting rest, but really during this phase of our cycle, we do need more sleep. We do need to rest more. I think it's kind of natural for our bodies to kind of veg a little bit in this state and give ourselves some grace. That's how we feel. So we maybe should take advantage of that rest phase of our cycle.
I love what you just said about that. And I do really think that during that phase you can eat, you can exercise towards, to support the different phases. But during that menstrual phase, you think of cultures that they actually went somewhere else, stayed in a tent for that week and didn't really have a lot of interactions with the other village people.
Right. It's really a time of stillness. Mm-hmm. And we don't have a lot of stillness in our world today. And so it's a good time to
embrace it. Yeah. Just embrace it.
Embrace some stillness in your life. And this is something as a woman we could teach our daughters better too. It's okay that you want to sleep a little bit more during this phase and to take a little bit easier in those things. The follicle phase is really a planning and a brainstorming phase. That's when you might find that you're thinking about the next thing that you want to create, or And that's natural because it's that planning and preparatory phase. It's really a great time to set goals.
Absolutely.
And really engage in some of the, because that's what your brain is wanting to do during that phase, which is really interesting. So that's another reason to if you're keeping track on your app, your calendar, make some notes. I've really had a lot of thoughts during this time. And then that ovulatory phase is really your peak productivity phase. That's when you might really tear into the closets and really get them organized. Or at work, you might be like, oh, I'm just, all these thoughts and things are coming because I'm in this really productive phase of my life. And then that luteal phase is when we kind of wrap it all up again. Yeah. You're kind of wrapping up your projects, wrapping up the things that you've been really productive about, and then start that wind down phase to kind of go into more of that rest period. And so it's really pretty beautiful that we have this, but we kind of clump that together, like we have to be productive every day of the month, or we have to keep our brain going, and we don't really do the wind down part.
No, it would actually be just a really good plan to schedule your life around the menstrual cycle. You know, that if you're going to be in charge of a project at work, that you're not starting on day one of your period. You know, give it some rest. And if you can make arrangements to do that when you're more in that follicular and ovulatory, be a good idea.
Right, and I think we're gaining more awareness around this. I know that women athletic teams now, they are more productive when they train around their cycle, when they're, as coaches are coaching them, they coach them around their cycle. They can get more out of their team player by doing it that way. And I think we as women could get more out of life as if we did just that. Looked at the whole picture instead of just right today.
Right.
So let's turn in and talk a little bit about how we can, when things aren't in sync and going the way they should, and we're experiencing some of those symptoms that really can dysregulate our life, what are some things we can do about that?
Well, the most common hormonal condition I see with the menstrual cycle is polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's PCOS for short. And not for every woman. It is a syndrome, so it can be, very mild or very severe and anywhere in between. But at any rate, the majority of women are still estrogen dominant. Whether you have PCOS or not, you're estrogen dominant and have a hard time making progesterone. And like you said, progesterone's the ice to the fire. Progesterone's very anti-inflammatory. It's very calming. It helps you sleep. And if we can nourish that luteal phase and that progesterone production from the corpus luteum, then many of those symptoms go away. The cycle can re-regulate so that you have just this monthly period, and anything's normal between having a 25, a 32-day cycle. It doesn't have to be 28-day cycle, but somewhere pretty close to that where you're not skipping months. And that all not only increases your opportunity for fertility and conception, but it changes the mood. It helps the mood stabilize and you're not quite so irritable. And so I'm going to go back to sleep for a second because we've talked about that now with the adrenals and the thyroid. But if you do not get enough sleep, you cannot make enough hormone. And they really can go together, in all of these organ systems really helping each other out. So, some of the main things I'll use for regulating the cycle and trying to improve the progesterone production, there's an herb called chase tree berry or vitex, same thing. And it works up in the pituitary to help increase LH, which is luteinizing hormone. And that's the one that helps you ovulate and make progesterone. So that if your LH is a little higher and you're supporting that, then it's very likely that you will ovulate better and make more progesterone. The other one that I use often with that is a GLA oil. You can get GLA oil in an evening primrose or a borage oil. Both of them provide a very good GLA, which is an omega-6. You're always here, avoid the omega-6s. This is a healthy omega-6. We like this one. So what it does is it helps you make an anti-inflammatory prostaglandin, and that helps with the progesterone, the ovulation, and eases up menstrual irregularities.
So with that, let's talk a little bit about nutrition. Good healthy fats are vital to making good healthy hormones.
Well, we make all of these hormones, all of our reproductive hormones, plus the cortisol that we've already talked about, cortisol and DHEA, from cholesterol. So you need to have good LDL cholesterol, and I, more often than not, like it a little higher than the reference range. Women will come in and say, oh, my cholesterol's high at 106 or something for that LDL cholesterol. I'm like, no, that's great. That's great. If you don't have enough cholesterol, you can't make your hormones out of it. And then there's also a condition called pregnenolone steal. So it's not a disease, as there's not a diagnostic code for it. But the LDL cholesterol will go to the adrenal gland and get converted into pregnenolone. And if you have a lot of stress, whatever kind of stress it is, and your body wants to make more cortisol, that pregnenolone will go to make cortisol, and you do not have it available to make progesterone. So if you have a really stressful month or a stressful episode, you can bleed heavier because of less progesterone. You can have more cramping, more irritability, and those premenstrual syndrome symptoms of breast tenderness. And so that's where stress really comes into, is that pregnenolone stealing your progesterone. So, the more you can just manage the stress, try and don't take on too many things. That's usually what I see, is just trying to take on too many projects and do too many things. And then you've got an irregular or a very symptomatic menstrual cycle.
What do you like when people are tracking symptoms? What are the things you want to know?
Yeah, with the tracking of the period, I like to know, what day does it start? Is it pretty close to that 28-day? Making sure that you're not skipping months or having 2 periods a month. Hardly anybody forgets having 2 periods a month. It's terrible. And then symptoms associated with that. I'll see headaches and migraines. That's pretty common, and I think that's a pretty difficult thing to help, but not always. Some people, some women, they can get rid of those headaches and migraines associated with that. But do you have breast tenderness? Do you spot a few days before you actually have a flow and bleed? We don't want things like that. So then you would do, on the app tracker, you'd put spotting, and then your first day is your flow. So sometimes it can be hard for women to say, well, what day's my day one? Is it when I spot or when I flow? And it's the flow. The spotting should not happen. Did you have breast tenderness that month, a few days before you're going to start your period? Or do you feel like you have a really short fuse? Those are the biggies.
And so that's like really for us taking a period report card.
Yes.
When it's flowing how we described in the beginning of this podcast, you would get an A.
Right.
Each one of those symptoms would probably take your grade down a little bit.
Yeah.
And the goal is to be in sync, having good rhythm, and being in rhythm and in tune. But often our environment contributes to endocrine disruptors. Birth control can be an endocrine disruptor. Mm-hmm. And so these are all things to be aware of that could be contributing to those symptoms. Mm-hmm. And so if you're having a lot of endocrine disruption, where's a place to start to help with that?
Well, I will mention in conventional medicine, you go in, you see your OB gynecologist, and they typically do just put you on oral birth control. And that seems to help the most with regulating the cycles. And if you have really heavy bleeding, it's usually an IUD. And you can do either or, but there is a negative downside to that. And so if you're using that as a birth control method, that's one thing. But if you're using it to control bleeding or to control symptoms, it's an entirely different thing to me. I'm like, if you need to control symptoms, it means something's wrong. And the birth control is not going to fix that. It's not going to fix what's wrong. And sometimes it can make things worse. So if you really are, don't want to use one of those, then you do more your lifestyle, herbal approaches, making sure that you're getting plenty of rest. And then, we can even say, well, the adrenal glands and the thyroid contribute to what's your menstrual cycle like. So it all really just plays a part of each other and going back and forth, this dance or this axis of, getting the hormones to function appropriately. So I will tell people, clean up your environment. Don't be using the petrochemicals on your lotions and sunscreens and all those things that you put on topically. Avoid plastics, avoid drinking water out of plastic bottles or the plastic coffee mugs that, they're contributing to that pollution in the body that disrupts the hormones. So if you can clean up your environment by getting rid of a lot of the chemicals, your body's going to work better. If you're getting plenty of rest, your body's going to work better. If you can avoid and manage your stress well, your menstrual cycle is going to be better. And you eat well, your menstrual cycle will be better.
Yeah. All the things that promote health and well-being will help promote a regular cycle.
Yeah.
So let's maybe encourage our listeners once again to embrace the cycle and not just track to know when your bleed cycle is, but track to know when all of your other phases and the things that are going well in your body are happening. Anything else that you would encourage?
Well, the thing that comes up so much with that these days is fertility. Infertility is definitely much more common, the last 10 years even, than it ever has been before. And I think a lot of it has to do with our stress levels and our environment. So, if you're really working on fertility, it becomes even that much more important. It's not just about regulating your cycle. It's about optimizing your cycle. Where you need good antioxidants. Like the antioxidants are your vitamins A, vitamin C, vitamin E, selenium's a great antioxidant, N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, alpha-lipoic acid. There's a number of good ones. And our body makes some of those, and the others we get out of our fruits and vegetables. So if you're really eating for a healthy ovulation and a healthy luteal phase, which is where you get pregnant, then your chance of actually getting pregnant is so much greater. And thyroid runs that a lot. Thyroid has a lot to do with fertility.
Yeah, I think we need a whole episode on that.
Yes, we could. We could.
So for our listeners this week, we've covered a lot of things. Hopefully you've learned some new things about your cycle and where you can embrace life a little bit better. And so I think that's our challenge for you this week, is to embrace life.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's just so important to understand the menstrual cycle. And, maybe we're taught that in, 6th grade a little bit. But I do think the majority of women don't really understand what is going on through those different parts of the cycle. So I love the idea if you start tracking symptoms and tracking, when your period is going to start, when it's going to end, and see how consistent that is, then that by itself is empowering. It's such a beautiful thing.
And even in tracking when you're the most productive, when you have the most creative thoughts going on, more than just the physical things, think about the thought processes that are happening and engage them in the different parts of your cycle.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I do too. So we hope you like it, and give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a week. And be vibrant and be beautiful, and we'll see you next week.